fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood Satellite.
Yeah, it's this book called Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes by Jacques Ellul. And he's an author who'd written some other stuff before. It's a pretty well-known book, and it gets mentioned a lot, and it's on the topic. It's pretty long, and not the longest book in the world, actually. And like a lot of books like this, it spends a fair amount of time repeating itself. After it establishes its thesis, it just spends time arguing where that thesis applies. But otherwise, it's a good book, and it's about what makes propaganda unique and what separates it from other forms of communication. And I think the reason this is important is a lot of people online, especially on any whatever political four-dimensional quadrant you sit on, they talk about propaganda, but everyone has a different definition of what propaganda is. And before we were talking about, going into, QAnon chats and going into these places where people just have these, I would say, a Pavlovian response to things like and we kind of do this broadly on the right, where we accuse people of being feds if they say the wrong thing. And a lot of the times it's justified, and it is accurate that federal agents are trying to control movements because they've done it in the past. Why would they stop? But, you go into a QAnon chat, if you even criticize it, they'll be like, Fed, who's paying you? Who's paying you to say that? And you kind of look like, what? Because you're not a Fed. And I'm like, me thinking you're weird and criticizing you wouldn't be what a federal agent does. Because you're over here talking about how you're literally fighting Satan through American politics. And that doesn't make any sense no matter how you look at it. But you start to realize, like, what is propaganda? I look at these people as propagandized individuals, and they would hate to look at themselves like that in a lot of ways. And I often use liberals as the best example of a propagandized individual. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So when we talk about propaganda, and this is relevant to me especially because I've been working more and more on this recently with various people, but how I define propaganda in this book, and I think it's important that people look at propaganda like this as its own special thing. So propaganda, how you measure its effectiveness is it needs to cause someone to do something. Propaganda must trigger an action. Now, what that seems obvious to people, but what that means is propaganda isn't actually about changing someone's mind. Propaganda is not about educating. Propaganda is not about replacing a mythology or an ideology with anything. Propaganda strictly is about triggering an action that you want. And effective propaganda is triggering someone to do something that is even counter to their beliefs. It goes against their own principles and their own mythological understanding and their faith even. So it's not about changing beliefs, and you might cling irrationally to that action. And he phrases that in the book, to cling irrationally to a form of behavior and kind of create these embedded reflexes. And liberals are bad at this because, you say a certain word and they'll be like, oh, don't say that. And you'll say, why? It's like it triggers a feeling in you. And an example I gave would be the Catholic Church is a good example, because you'll be sitting in Mass, Sunday Mass, and a priest will be talking, and the priest might start reminding people that it is against the Catholic faith to endorse homosexuality. And I was in the Sunday Mass where they did this, and a chill went through the crowd, and people were kind of looking at each other like, oh my God, what's he saying? And of course, the Catholic Church is against homosexuality. All Christianity is supposed to be. You might get, of course, like the Anglican Church has their own thing they're doing now, but to Catholics who've been Catholic their entire lives, they get this feeling and they're like, oh my God, we can't say that. And then they get afraid. They're like, you kind of want to tell the priest to shut up. But that's a propagandized individual. Like, what you believe, and you've believed it your whole life. However, you've been implanted with this sort of Pavlovian response to stay away from certain topics and to react with hostility to someone who brings it up. Now, they're obviously not hostile to the priest, but that is if they've been conditioned. So when Alex Jones, people kind of make fun of Alex Jones for saying, we're breaking the conditioning. But really, there is truth to that. You are a propagandized individual if you have these reflexes that you don't really understand. And interestingly, propaganda, here's another factoid about it, it can't create something out of nothing. So effective propaganda has to play within the individual's frames of reference. So you'll see this with national propaganda. Like, you need to appeal to their own national myths and their national principles. And here's a great example of that, is that if you look at the propaganda of the Soviet Union and America, they're both appealing kind of to the same thing. If you look at Soviet propaganda and American capitalist propaganda, it's both about the worker, it's both about freedom, and it's both about national identity, really. So it's like they actually are within the framework of that, but they have wildly different actions they want you to take. But if you actually boil it down to what they're talking about, a lot of propaganda appeals to the exact same fundamental things about freedom to be yourself and shit like that. So that's an interesting way of looking at it. And he makes a claim that might sound extreme to some, but I do believe it's like, truth is powerless without propaganda. That you can't just have the truth. And a lot of people will say these terms like truth and freedom, everyone believes in them, but they have radically different views of what that means. We covered this in the last episode. Even when we look at, various folkways coming out of England and settling America, the Anglicans, the Quakers, the Appalachians, and all the others, like, they all say they're on the side of freedom. They each have different definitions of freedom. So everyone believes in the truth, but the truth can't just exist in the abstract. Truth needs to be manifested in some way. And so it's like, whatever you believe true, you need action. That's kind of what ritual is as well. Ritual, we have these rituals in society because anything that we believe, we have to manifest it physically in the world, in society, in civilization, whatever it is. This is why, like, if you're a pagan, you know that rituals are important to paganism. The rituals are important to Christianity. People might scoff at, going to church. Like, you hear this all the time from people who say they're Christian. Like, my father-in-law does this. It's like, oh, my God doesn't care where I go. Well, also, your God doesn't exist. Your God in your mind is just, it's just a fail safe for you. It's just like, I'm hedging my bets and saying I believe in God, but you don't actually do anything. So, and that's kind of where Christianity, a lot of denominations are these days. But the idea that for something to be real, it must be manifested in the world as real. Otherwise, it might as well not exist. So anything you believe to be true, whatever the ideology that may be, whatever it may be, if it doesn't have some action in the real world, it might as well not exist. So that's why, truth without propaganda, right, and the things that trigger you to do things, whatever that thing may be. I'm not saying violence. I'm saying fucking going to church. I'm saying doing a prayer, saying the right words in the right order. That's kind of what that is. And myths are deeper than ideologies, obviously. Like, you can really believe something, be willing to die for something. But, a myth kind of becomes an ideology when actions applied to it. So one example is, like, effective propaganda has people behaving counter to their beliefs. And like the example I just gave with a Christian living in a liberal paradigm will behave more like a liberal than an actual Christian, which is interesting. Here's a case that happened recently, just to show you the extent of what can happen. So this was from the news maybe a couple weeks ago, but it was this woman who was raped on a train. I'm reading a story now from CNN. A woman is raped and onlookers record it. The story beyond the outrage. There's a woman who was raped broad daylight in front of people on Southeastern Pennsylvania Transport Authority in Philadelphia, and people were just watching.
Several people watching, some within arm's length, says Upper Darby Superintendent of Police, whose officers are investigating the rape of a female passenger on the Market-Frankfurt line Wednesday night on a train heading west to Upper Darby.
It's a horrendous act, and unfortunately we live in a time right now where there are horrendous things, as always.
Arrested is 35-year-old Fishton Noy, who investigators say is seen on a train security camera sitting next to the alleged victim, touching her, and then raping her.
Now, normally you would think that why didn't anyone jump in? Why didn't anyone start a fight? Why didn't anyone do anything? Because these people have been propagandized to such a degree where they say, I can't do that. I can't. What am I supposed to do? Just do something? I can't. And so they've been propagandized over their lives to think that, doing what comes naturally is wrong. And another thing is, if you live in Canada, it's different than in America. So if someone breaks into your house, you would think, oh, I can be able to shoot them, to kill them, and then you can't. You might go to jail. So over the course, like, you're being brainwashed into thinking that I can't do this, I can't do X or Y will happen, to the point where I need to allow a rape or murder because I can't commit this action. Otherwise, like, I'm afraid of it. And that's just, you might believe deep down that rape is wrong. You might believe deep down that men who commit rape should be prosecuted and maybe even killed for it. But when confronted with it, you can't do it because your entire life you've been told and conditioned to just not do anything. And you might be full of anger at that moment. You don't believe that it's good. You might feel like I should do something, but you can't, and something is stopping you. And that's kind of the effect of propaganda. It has your actions the opposite of what your will is. It's the inversion of will in some way, or it has you doing something that you don't want to even do. That's a shocking way. That's one, like, ripped from the headlines. Like, how does this happen? Well, this is kind of how it happens. You know, he makes a point in the book that I really like, because he says propaganda has to exist on two levels. It has to exist on the level of the individual. So it's speaking directly to you, but it also has to speak to the collective, the broad collective, the entire civilization or the culture or the race or whatever it is. Those are the two it works at. But he said the enemy of effective propaganda is the small group. So if you're an individual, you're very susceptible to propaganda. If you're part of this huge mass of identity, same thing. But if it's you and like 12 guys, that's the kind of unit where you can actually rebel against things. An individual can't rebel, and a collective can't really do it. But if you got, that's kind of like a unit of community where there's enough of you where you can kind of establish your own little hierarchy and say, and kind of go amongst yourself like, hey, does this make sense? This seems crazy to me. Does this seem crazy to you? Yeah, it seems crazy to me. So you can kind of reinforce each other. So to fight back against propaganda, you can't do it as an individual. You can't even really do it as an identity. But if you get like 20 guys together, that's where you can actually kind of go against prevailing ideas or things like that. So I thought the fact that he established that, I thought was very interesting. I think that would appeal to you, especially as a nuke-loving ANCAP. Here's a piece of propaganda that I thought was really interesting. This movie, Squid Game. So there's this movie on Netflix that came out. It was a South Korean movie called Squid Game. And everyone was watching this movie. And I would be at work, and all the people who are just kind of normal, regular people, like, oh my God, did you watch Squid Game? And then I know for a fact, I'm like, none of you niggas have ever watched a South Korean movie. You don't watch a South Korean movie unless you're told to. So, because I remember right when Squid Game came out, there was Netflix announcing that this is our most watched movie maybe ever. So, the only reason they watched it was because essentially people are watching this movie. Hold on 2 seconds. Oh yeah. Sorry, my wife just came in and she showed me a note she'd written that says Squid Game is a TV show. All right, I'm sorry. Sorry.
I wasn't going to correct you.
Sir, watching this TV show. Thank you, sweetheart. But it's like there was this meme on 4chan years ago that, and I'm saying this from the perspective of a guy who works in marketing, that this was the perfect distillation of propaganda. I loved it. And I haven't found anything that was so perfect as this. It was this one sentence people were posting, and they don't do it anymore, but they did back then. It was, people are reading Culture of Critique. About the book by Kevin McDonald, Culture of Critique. People would just say that. People are reading Culture of Critique. And what that does immediately is it's social proof. People are doing this. It doesn't say whether it's good or bad. It doesn't say that you should read it. It doesn't say that this is the best book ever. It's the most important. It says, hey, people, everyone's talking about this. And then you feel like, oh my God, I need to know what this is. And maybe you don't read it, but you look it up. You look it up and learn a bit about it. And it's establishing social proof. And that's the best thing of propaganda. Everyone's doing this. That's what happened to Squid Game. All they said was everyone's watching this movie, and everyone these people don't even like subtitles shows. I keep saying movie shows. People don't like subtitles. They don't like Korean stuff. This was kind of a weird movie. It was a kind of a horror thing. These people don't usually like that, but just hearing that that's what everyone else was doing was enough to trigger that action to get people to watch it. And I love the simplicity of that. And I think that that's what's missing to kind of make this a bit more relevant. That's what's missing on the right. So the right, what they use for propaganda purposes, and they will openly call it propaganda purposes, are memes. And memes are, I like memes. I'm a huge meme guy. But I think where they go wrong is they're trying to brainwash people with beliefs and mythologies rather than just action. So the ones who do this right are usually the fitness guys, telling people like, go lift, go drink water. Are you drinking water? Just stop jerking off. Just stop it. Don't action. But a lot of the memes about like rediscover your heritage. Here's something you can yearn for. Here's a blonde woman walking through a wheat field.
Remember what they took from you. That kind of shit.
Yeah. Remember what they took for you. Well, here's the problem. No one does. No one remembers what you're telling me what they took from me. And you're actually doing kind of a lazy job because you just went on DuckDuckGo and you typed in old Europe things and you found a bunch of images and then you put some text to it. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to implant a memory, which isn't the right thing to do. Propaganda. So I would say this message to people who are working on this stuff. Ask yourself, what action are you trying to encourage? Now this works very well when people is like, go to the gym, drink more water, stop jerking off, and then just finding ways to do that. But if it's like, have an identity, do it, go, this identity, have it. No, that doesn't work. That's too deep. It's too mythological. You can't even propagandize with an ideology. You can only propagandize on very specific actions on a very immediate way. And once you think of it, like, you're not even really trying to address what they secretly believe, their motivations, what spiritual things. And this is where Christianity really fucks up. Like Christianity, any religion, they're firing off in every direction. They don't know what they're doing. No priest in the world knows how to get people to church. I've talked to priests before, and they're scratching their head like, we don't know what to do. So they more than anyone, they're struggling with this. But there's another angle to this, which is kind of interesting, which is that's propagandizing your own people. How do you propagandize an enemy? Try and fuck them up with propaganda, which you would do in times of war. And so first of all, obviously, propaganda needs to speak their language. It needs to be executed within a region. This is why it's so weird if you see like people dropping leaflets from planes. It's like you are signaling to everyone that this is the enemy doing something. Right. I think that's just kind of throw people off like, oh, we're going to drop a bunch of fucking pamphlets in Arabic talking about how good Swiss chalet is or something. But, it thrives in things that it has to be in their language, in their region, it has to come up through them. And it really relies on things that can't be disproven, including statistics. Propaganda loves statistics or data or secrets or talking about motivations of the other guy, stuff like that. That's why QAnon is so good. QAnon is such effective propaganda because we've proven it's enough to inspire action. You can tell people what to do, but it's so vague and it gestures very broadly to these people are evil. It's the darkness. They're satanic even. And they really buy into it very emotionally. And there are all these Pavlovian responses coded into your average QAnon person, where if you even challenge it, you're a federal agent. So I think if you want to see the most effective propaganda possibly ever, it is QAnon. And I think one day, like I've said before, we will get a top-down case study of who started this and how and when. I kind of know where it started and everything, but it's so great to see the effect it's had on people, and that it is an identity within itself. Like if you look at what they produce, like it is kind of a holistic, consistent theme, which is weird to think of. It's kind of the American flag plus the cross plus like badass stuff. It's like super. It's very Christian, but not actually. Like it's performatively Christian. It's a lot of people saying, I'm praying for you and I hate the Antichrist. But what is the Antichrist to you? It's the people who took Trump away. Like stuff like that. Like it doesn't make sense, but it's so fucking effective. And effective propaganda of the enemy. And this is what leftists are very good at. So be careful of this. Leftists are good at bringing in their enemy into their own frame of reference. This is what gets conservatives all the fucking time. that the left, and these aren't even like dyed in the wool Marxists, like these are just kind of leftists, these are surface level, but they trip up conservatives so fucking much, it's astounding, by saying like, you know, all white people are racist. No, not all white people are racist. Like every argument a conservative gets into, they end up conceding 20% of their stance every single time. This is what, like, you know, if you read Rules for Radicals by Alinsky, like this is kind of it. Like he'll lay out, like bring them into, make them using your terminology, your dialogue, because every time they accept it, they legitimize you. So even if you're getting your enemy to argue against your propaganda, you are in some way forcing them to admit that your propaganda is valid. And the one thing I think that the right has done very, very effectively is popularizing the term anti-white, because it's forced the leftists, maybe the first time in a long time, to admit that white is an identity. Because you'll remember, traditionally, they were telling you that white people don't exist. They're telling you that's made up, it's a cope, whatever. You're getting the leftists to say that's not anti-white. They've just admitted that white exists. Boom, done. We've brought them into our frame of reference. That's how you do it, bit by bit, little by little tiny actions, little tiny arguments. You're not trying to drop, you're not making a whole worldview and then making advertisements for it. So that's the big thing I want people to remember, that if you are using propaganda, they're not advertisements for an ideology. And I can say that because I am in advertising. So this is coming from my professional experience as well, because a lot of people think of ad men as these like big, first of all, ad men aren't knowledgeable. They're very dumb. Usually it's very easy to figure this stuff out. And once you realize that, you realize you can play within that system. And there's a lot of bad advertisements. Don't mimic the bad advertisements. Take advertising seriously. And remember that a good advertisement doesn't try and convince you of the validity of the thing. They just want you to buy a Coke. You know, they want you to buy a car or something. And then, you know, even though you get into, you arguing about this is the great thing about like Apple versus Microsoft, that you getting really involved in the debate of which is better, you've already entered within the framework of everyone needs a computer. You see, what larger framework are you getting into by even having these arguments? And look to conservatives, because they are the poster boy for people who validate their enemies by getting tricked by every single fucking piece of propaganda. And that's how you have the conservatives where they are today. You know, it's just a fucking joke. And, you know, he makes the claim, and we can end this soon, I'm sure, but he makes the claim that democracy cannot exist. I think this is why it's popular with the right. Says democracy can't exist because in a modern era, there is no such thing as a non-propagandized individual. You really can't find a blank slate. You can't find someone who doesn't have that baggage already. So what are you going to do about that? You know, so the idea of democracy, that everyone's treated equally, not really. They're just vectors for different forms of propaganda. And it's almost like you can look at each citizen as a piece of propaganda, as an ideology, because they're just a little vector point for that ideology trying to engage in a fight. So really, there is no will of the people. You can't, there's no people. And he makes a point in the book that really likes it. It's like, you cannot be on the side of people. There is no people. There is no, and that is anti-Marxist, because Marxists, and I would argue like a lot of the mainstream anarchists are like, okay, there's the people, and then there's the institutions, and then there's the powers. The power, then the people. I'm like, no, I don't think so. I think there's just various shades of propagandized individuals who don't get along, and they take their ideologies very, very seriously. They take their myths very, very seriously. And they might for that moment think they're not propagandized. No one believes they're propagandized. But really think about what sort of Pavlovian responses do you have to things? What do you do without thinking about? Everyone has that. It's just sometimes you like yours more than the enemy's, but you cannot have a non-propagandized individual because they're going to be Christian American. If you're a Christian American, 70% of your behavior is right there. You know, you haven't really thought that much about why you do the things you do. You just accept them. I'm not saying that's bad. I think that's every society. I think that's every civilization. It's unrealistic to think you could have a large group where everyone is just self-critical all the time. Nothing gets done. However, just be aware that, you know, that's probably the best argument against democracy, that there's no just people. There's no guy. Even though they like the guy living in the woods, I've always made this argument to people, like they think, there's political people and there's real people, the rural people who don't care about this stuff. Like, no, they do care. Like, ask any redneck who doesn't own a smartphone. Go to fucking Virginia. He lives in the woods. Maybe he's got an ATV, whatever. Ask him if he has any opinions on how the world should be run. I bet he'll have a bunch. I bet he'll talk to you for 2 hours about what he thinks the world should be. No matter what level you go to, there's no standard person. Every person is like 70% propagandized person. They just differ on what the propaganda is. And the liberal is the propagandized more than all. Like 90% of what they do is propagandized, but they're just dumb and they can't make sense of it. They can't begin to unpack their psychology of all these contradictory things they do. Example, like they hate big pharma, but will defend to death the vaccine. How do you end up like, how we ask ourselves, like, what is up with these fucking liberals? Like they understand big pharma is wicked and evil, but until they make this vaccine, then they're gods. How do you do that? Well, if you're a propagandized individual, that makes a lot more sense. You can get that doesn't bother them. They don't even see that this contradiction or hypocrisy is an issue. So a hyper propagandized person won't even be aware or can't even be aware of their own hypocrisies. Anyway, I guess that's really what I want to talk about with propaganda, like the end point of really, if you're trying to create propaganda, like what action are you actually trying to inspire? And don't just make advertisements for ideologies, really. And look at classical propaganda. It's like, what are they trying to do? Buy war bonds, buy local, we kind of go that way, like buy from us. But it's bad, It's bad advertising a lot of the time.
There's kind of a relationship between ideology and action too. I mean, you can kind of land on either side of it depending on where you are, but sometimes an ideology is a justification for an action, and sometimes an action is a justification for an ideology. And like, if you're the sort of person who your goal is actually just to convert people and like increase the population within your ideology, I'm not on that side personally. Like, I don't think that is interesting or like that's not powerfully motivating to me. To me, it really is about the action anyways. Like, the whole point of the ideology is to inspire action. So you shouldn't be propagandizing regardless toward an ideology if you want action, because the ideology is just a stepping stone. You should actually you should be selling the action. And like, as you say, the action is the thing that's not necessarily easier to sell, but it at least can be sold. Because the ideology is not even something that is going to get traction through propaganda.
Well, and also propaganda is how you track the effectiveness of it. You can tell when people do a thing. It's hard to tell the effectiveness of any sort of ideology unless there's action. So a great example, like I said,
belief or something.
Yeah. That's why those statistics can get manipulated so much. But you'll conduct polls saying that 60% of Canada remains Christian. And they'll say that. They'll check that box on the form. Are they going to church? No. There's been a drop-off of church attendance by, 70%, whatever it is. So it's like, okay, that's a great way to measure, like where the rubber meets the road. I keep using that phrase, where the rubber meets the road. I'm sorry. But really, it's like what actions are taken, because anyone can say they're religious. Anyone can say they're spiritual. But if it is not manifested in the real world, does it even exist? Does anything even matter if it only exists in your head? So not only are we measuring the effectiveness of, propaganda and whatnot, but we're measuring the effectiveness of an ideology, because anyone can say they believe in freedom. Is it something you'd fight for? I don't want to go too much into violence or anything, but it's like, is this something you would take any action whatsoever in real life to manifest? Because unless it's manifested in the world, it doesn't fucking matter. There's a line from this book. We can end on this, but just to say, I think this is interesting. Obviously, propaganda can succeed only when man feels challenged. It can have no influence when the individual is stabilized, relaxing in his slippers in the midst of total security. Neither past events nor great metaphysical problems challenge the average individual, the ordinary man of our times. He is not sensitive to what is tragic in life. He does not feel challenged except by current events, political or economic. Therefore, propaganda must start with current events. It would not reach anybody if it tried to base itself on historical facts. We have not seen Vichy propaganda fail when it tried to invoke the images of Napoleon and Joan of Arc in hopes of arousing the French to turn against England. Even facts so basic and deeply rooted in the French consciousness are not a good springboard for propaganda. They pass quickly into the realm of history and consequently into neutrality and indifference. And I liked that because I think that ties a lot to what people think is good propaganda, especially the traditional propaganda, like we kind of talked about. Remember what they took from you. Look, didn't it used to be better in the past? Even people who might believe that will say, was it? This feels like you're skipping some stuff here. So just these broad appeals to history, not only do they not work, for us weird schizos, but they don't work for the regular person because that's even abstract. It's like, remember when it's good? Maybe they don't. And no one's questioned that before. No one said, hey, maybe these people have no frame of reference to, you're showing them as like, don't you want to live on a homestead? I don't know. Do I? I have no idea what that's like. I have no idea what it's like to live as a peasant in the 1700s. So you saying, look how much better it used to be. I'm like, was it? I don't know. It takes a lot for me to trust you on that, unless that is also part of the propaganda. So part of the propaganda should not be, would you like to live as a peasant? Would you like to live, hey, remember being serfs? That was awesome. No, it should be like being close to nature. The first piece of propaganda ought to be go into the woods, do something in the woods. I got a piece of propaganda for you. Have you spoken the truth today? Something like that. Like have a conversation. I want you, here's a piece of propaganda. Have a conversation with someone about what you believe. Just whatever it is. That's an action. Take that action. Then we go from there. But don't just believe. It's like, no, here's a propaganda. Go have a conversation with someone you don't even know very well about something you believe that you're uncomfortable about. Do that today. Do that once a week. Boom. Propaganda. There you go. That's just, anyway, I got to get going now, but that's just, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I totally agree with that. And I think even that one, telling people to go speak about what they believe, there's a lot of stuff you could use that is stilted in our favor because their side has already used it to extinction, but we haven't used it. So like, go tell people what you believe. I mean, they're doing that every fucking day. We just have to tune them out. It's time that we started. So yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Calling for action is where we're at.
And calling for action, and not broad action, because people will say like, we need action, and that action equals revolution. Guys, revolution now, go, revolution, go. And
we talk about that all the time. One thing we've been consistent on for years is when we talk about action, we're talking about very, very specific things, and we're humble about it. But I'm sure given 1,000 examples of very specific, local, regular, like instant actions that you can take as a person. And we're not talking about violent shit. We're talking about go help your neighbor, mow your fucking lawn. We're talking about wash your dick level shit. But like that's kind of where we're at, and it's important. So
again, just to end on that, you want to know why Jordan Peterson is so effective? He understands this. I don't know whether it's consciously, if he puts that at the front of his fucking cerebral cortex or anything, but he's 12 rules for life. Follow these rules. And then people make fun of him for that. But guess what? They make fun of him, and then they're staggered by how popular it is. And they just can't unpack why. Well, here's why. Because he gets it. Here's some rules. Here's some shit you can do right now today to make your life better and to action your ideology or what you believe in the real world. And it's going to sound, reductive, I bet. But that's what makes it effective. Anyway.